The unexpected arrival. Lieutenant Harris stood on the edge of the dense alien forest, staring out into the unknown. The air felt different here, heavy with an energy that he couldn't quite place. It was the kind of feeling that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had been stationed on this strange planet for 2 weeks now, but today felt different. Something was off. Something was about to happen. The planet, known as Thalia, was quiet. Too quiet. Harris had grown used to the strange sounds of the wildlife. Alien creatures that made odd, otherworldly noises at night. But today the usual calls were missing. There was no chirping, no rustling in the trees. It was like the entire world had gone silent. Harris adjusted his helmet and checked his communication device, but there was nothing new. No messages, no orders, just silence. It was as if the military command had forgotten about him here, in this remote outpost. He hadn't seen another human for days, and he was beginning to wonder if something was wrong. He looked at his wristwatch. Another hour had passed since his last patrol, and yet he felt a strange sense of unease gnawing at him. Normally, he would have pushed it aside, chalking it up to nerves or exhaustion. But not today. Today, his instincts screamed at him to pay attention. Something was coming. Something big. Without thinking, he grabbed his rifle and started walking deeper into the forest, towards the distant mountains that loomed over the horizon. The forest on Thalia was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The trees were massive, their trunks twisting and spiraling up into the sky like something from a nightmare. The leaves were a deep, glowing purple, casting an eerie light across the ground. It was a beautiful, yet unsettling place. As Harris walked, the ground beneath his boots began to tremble. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but then it grew stronger, more pronounced. His heart began to race. He stopped, trying to steady his breath. The tremors seemed to come from somewhere deep below, like the planet itself was alive. The soldier felt a chill run down his spine. Something was moving beneath the surface. But what? He scanned the area, his rifle raised, ready for anything. His mind raced through possible scenarios. Was it some kind of alien creature? A natural disaster? Or, he swallowed hard, something worse. The air was thick with the strange energy again. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Harris's grip tightened on his rifle. He wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever was coming, but he knew he had to stay alert. His training kicked in, and he crouched low, blending into the shadows of the trees. Just as he was about to move forward, he heard something, a rustle of leaves. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The noise was faint, but it was there. Someone, or something, was nearby. He wasn't alone. For a moment, Harris debated whether to move or stay hidden. He wanted to call for backup, but the comms were still down. He had no way of reaching anyone. He was on his own. Suddenly, he heard it again, louder this time. A deep guttural growl that made his blood run cold. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet were frozen in place. The growl was coming from behind him. Slowly, he turned his head, hoping he was wrong. But when he saw what was emerging from the trees, he knew he wasn't. 4 figures stepped out from the shadows. They were tall, much taller than any human, and moved with an eerie grace. Their skin shimmered with an almost metallic sheen, glowing faintly in the low light. They had long, flowing hair that rippled with the wind, and their eyes gleamed with a sharp, predatory intelligence. Harris held his breath, his mind racing. He had heard rumors about the species that inhabited this planet, but he had never seen them in person. These were the women of Thalia, the ones the soldiers had been warned about, the ones who were known to hunt down intruders during their mating season. He could feel his pulse in his throat as they moved closer. They were no longer looking for food. They weren't predators hunting for meat. They were searching for something, or someone else. Harris's stomach twisted. The stories he had heard were true. These aliens didn't just hunt for survival. They hunted for pleasure, for power. They had no mercy for those who crossed their path. And as far as he knew, humans weren't welcome on Thalia during the mating season. The four women stood still for a moment, their eyes scanning the area. Harris could see the sharp tips of their teeth as they smiled. Their lips curled in what could only be described as a predatory grin. Harris's body tensed. He knew he had to move, but he didn't know where to go. The trees around him were too dense to make a quick escape, and his hiding spot was far from perfect. He had no way of knowing if they had already spotted him, or if they were just toying with him. His mind raced. He had to find a way out. He had to hide. But there was no way to know if his hiding spot would be enough. The alien women were skilled hunters. They could find anyone, anywhere. And once they locked onto their target, there was no escaping them. The first alien turned her head, her sharp eyes scanning the forest. Harris's breath caught in his throat. She was getting closer. The hunt had begun. And Harris was the prey. The silence of the forest was deafening as the alien women moved closer, their footsteps light but purposeful. Harris had to make a choice: stay hidden and hope for the best, or try to outrun them and risk being caught. Every second felt like an eternity as he waited for the perfect moment to act. This was only the beginning. The hiding plan. Lieutenant Harris's heart thudded in his chest as he watched the four alien women slowly move closer, their glowing eyes scanning the forest like predators on the hunt. They were terrifying, almost otherworldly in their appearance. Tall and graceful, yet their presence radiated danger. Harris's instincts screamed at him to run, to flee as fast as he could, but there was no way he would outrun them. He had to think. He had to survive. In a split second, Harris made a choice. His only chance was to hide. Deep in the heart of the forest, far away from where they would expect him. He knew the alien terrain like the back of his hand, having spent the past 2 weeks exploring every inch of the land during his mission. The forest was dense with strange, towering trees that twisted and spiraled toward the sky. The thick foliage would provide the perfect cover, but Harris knew that he had to be careful. These creatures were not just hunters. They were skilled trackers, able to sense even the faintest disturbances in the air. He darted toward a nearby thicket, moving silently between the trees, his breath shallow as he tried to stay out of their line of sight. Every step felt like an eternity, his boots barely making a sound as he moved deeper into the alien woods. He knew that the slightest noise, the smallest mistake, could give him away. The rustling of the leaves seemed to echo through the silence of the forest, and every twig under his foot felt like an alarm bell. Harris's mind raced as he reached a dense cluster of trees and vines. His eyes scanned the area for the perfect hiding spot, something that could conceal him completely. He spotted it, a thick trunk of an ancient alien tree, its bark twisted in strange patterns. The tree was hollow, its center filled with dark shadows. It was the perfect place to remain unseen. He crouched low, his pulse racing, and slipped into the hollow space. His rifle was tight in his grip, his senses heightened. He could feel his breath getting louder, his heartbeat thumping in his ears. But there was no time to panic. The alien women were still out there, and he had to stay as still as possible. From his hidden position, Harris watched as the four women moved closer to where he had been standing moments before. They were talking among themselves in a language he couldn't understand, their voices low and melodic, but there was a dark undertone to their words. He could sense their intelligence, their calculated movements. They were methodical, as if they knew exactly what they were doing. Harris's eyes narrowed as he studied them. They were circling the area, their glowing eyes scanning the trees, the ground, the very air around them. They were searching for something, and he was their target. It wasn't just a hunt. It was a game, a twisted game where the prey had no chance unless they were clever enough to hide, to outwit their pursuers. Harris's mind raced with questions. Why had they targeted him? What did they want with a human soldier? Were they simply curious, or was there something more to their presence here on Thalia? He had no answers, only a deep sense of dread that gnawed at him from the inside. As the minutes passed, Harris remained perfectly still, his muscles aching from the tension. Every so often, the women would pause, sniffing the air, their heads tilting slightly as if they sensed something out of place. Harris held his breath each time, praying they wouldn't discover him. His rifle felt heavy in his hands, but he knew it wouldn't do much good if they found him. It wasn't just their strength that made them dangerous, it was their intelligence. They knew how to outthink their prey, how to trap them, how to force them into a corner. The alien women moved in a synchronized pattern, methodical and patient. They were like a well-oiled machine, each one knowing their role in the hunt. They circled the area again, getting closer and closer to Harris's hiding spot. He could see the glint of their eyes through the gaps in the trees, their forms a blur as they passed. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat seeming to echo through the hollow of the tree. He gripped his rifle tighter, his palms slick with sweat. Then one of the women stopped suddenly, her head snapping toward Harris's hiding spot. For a split second, Harris's heart skipped a beat. She had sensed something, his presence perhaps. His breath caught in his throat. Was this it? Was she going to find him? She stood completely still, her sharp eyes searching the shadows. Harris's pulse raced. Every muscle in his body was frozen, but his mind was working faster than ever. He had to think of something, some way to escape, to survive. The woman stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Harris's mind screamed at him to move, to run, but he remained as still as possible. He had no choice. He had to trust that his hiding place would be enough, that the thick bark of the tree and the dense foliage would shield him from her sight. The woman moved closer, her long fingers brushing the edges of the tree. Harris's breath stopped. She was inches away. He could feel her presence, like a weight pressing down on him. He could almost hear her thoughts, the way she hunted, the way she searched for weakness. And then, just as quickly as she had stopped, the woman turned away. She was looking at something else now. Harris let out a slow, quiet breath, his heart still racing. She hadn't found him. But Harris knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. The women were relentless, and soon they would discover him if he didn't act. He had to make a choice, stay hidden and risk being found, or take a chance and make a run for it. The plan was simple, but the risks were high, and every moment he stayed still only increased the danger. He glanced out from his hiding place, watching the alien women as they continued their search. They hadn't seen him. Not yet. But how much longer could he stay hidden? The alien search begins. The silence of the forest stretched on, thick and suffocating. Lieutenant Harris remained in his hidden position, his back pressed against the cold, twisted bark of the alien tree. His heartbeat was deafening in his ears as he kept his eyes fixed on the 4 alien women who were now spreading out across the forest floor, their movements calculated and methodical. They were no longer just moving aimlessly, searching blindly for any sign of him. No, this was no longer just a hunt. It was a pursuit, a game of cat and mouse, and Harris was the mouse. He knew it was only a matter of time before they discovered his hiding spot. He could feel it in the air. The tension was palpable, making it almost impossible to think clearly. Every step the aliens took, every rustle of leaves, every shift in the atmosphere felt like a countdown to his discovery. The first alien woman moved silently between the trees, her eyes narrowed, scanning the area with a predator's precision. She was tall, even taller than Harris, and her steps were calculated, as if she knew exactly where he could be hiding. Her glowing eyes flicked over the forest, pausing momentarily at each rustling bush, each dark shadow, her gaze lingering just long enough to make Harris's pulse spike. He held his breath, praying that she wouldn't turn his way. She stopped. Harris's stomach clenched. The air seemed to freeze. Had she sensed him? Had his heartbeat given him away? For a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The alien woman tilted her head slightly, as though listening for something, her sharp, predatory gaze scanning the space in front of her. Harris could feel the weight of her stare, even from his hidden position. Every muscle in his body was tense, coiled like a spring, waiting for the moment she would step closer, or worse, discover his presence. But instead of advancing, she moved in the opposite direction, her sharp eyes passing over his hiding spot without a second glance. The tension in Harris's body released in a slow, silent exhale. He could still hear his heart thumping in his chest. But for now, he was safe. The woman continued her search, joining the other three as they spread out even farther. Harris didn't dare move, not even an inch. His hands were sweaty, gripping his rifle with white knuckles. His mind raced, trying to think of a way to escape. There was no way he could stay hidden here forever. His location was good for now, but the forest was vast, and the aliens were far too skilled to miss him for long. The longer he stayed in one place, the greater the risk. One of the other aliens, the one with the long silver hair that shimmered in the faint light, stopped to sniff the air. The gesture was almost animalistic, and Harris couldn't help but shiver. These aliens were nothing like any human he had encountered before. They weren't just intelligent. They were primal, their instincts sharp and attuned to their surroundings in a way he couldn't comprehend. It was as if they could sense the very essence of the forest itself, every vibration, every pulse, every tiny movement. The alien woman's eyes darted around, landing on a nearby patch of thick, purple foliage. She crouched low, her movements graceful and silent. Harris's breath caught in his throat. He could see her eyes scanning the ground, moving inch by inch toward his hiding spot. There was no escape. If she found him now, he would have nowhere to run. The woman's nostrils flared as she crouched even lower, moving closer. Harris held his breath, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The rifle in his hand suddenly felt like a burden, too loud, too heavy. The alien woman's hand extended toward a nearby vine, and for a moment, Harris thought she would touch the very spot where he was hiding. He thought it was over. But then, as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. The woman stood up, sniffed the air once more, and turned away. She moved off into the forest, continuing her search. Harris let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He was lucky, this time, but how much longer could he keep getting lucky? The other two aliens were still searching farther out, their movements swift and purposeful. Harris knew he couldn't stay in his current spot for much longer. If the aliens didn't find him, the next time they circled around, they might notice something strange about the area. They could sense even the smallest of disruptions in their environment. And as skilled as they were, they wouldn't stop until they found him. He had to move. But where? His mind raced, calculating every possible option. The forest was dense, and moving recklessly could get him caught. He had to find another place to hide, somewhere even deeper in the woods. The trees here were thick enough, but there were areas beyond where the foliage was nearly impenetrable. It was a risk, but it might be his only chance. Without a moment to spare, Harris slipped out of his hiding place, moving quietly and slowly to avoid making any noise. He crouched low, his body pressed against the ground, using the shadows to his advantage. His heart was still racing, but his thoughts were clear. He needed to get ahead of them, to stay one step ahead of the aliens at all costs. The hunt had only just begun, but he had no intention of being their prey. As he moved deeper into the forest, Harris knew that the next few minutes would be critical. He had to move faster, think quicker, and be smarter than his pursuers. If he hesitated, even for a moment, they would find him. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. The alien women were still close behind. They had spread out, covering more ground with each passing second. But Harris was determined not to be found. Not today. This was a fight for survival. And he wasn't going down without a fight. The unexpected encounter. Lieutenant Harris pressed himself flat against the cool, damp ground, every muscle in his body tight with tension. The alien forest around him seemed to close in. the massive trees looming like silent sentinels, casting long shadows over the land. He could hear the distant calls of the alien women as they moved deeper into the woods, their voices a strange melodic hum that sent a chill down his spine. They were still searching, still on the hunt. But now it seemed they were more methodical, their movements calculated, as if they were toying with him. Harris knew that he couldn't afford to stay still for much longer. The last time they had passed him, he had barely escaped detection, and his heart was still pounding from a close call. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig beneath his boots, felt like an alarm ringing in the quiet of the forest. He had to keep moving, stay one step ahead. But the question was, where to go? He had memorized the terrain during his short time on the planet, but the alien forest was unpredictable, always shifting, always changing. And no matter how well he knew the land, the women were far better at navigating it. They seemed to move with an effortless grace, like shadows slipping through the trees, always in control, always aware of their surroundings. Harris knew he couldn't outrun them. If he tried, they would catch him. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He cautiously picked his way through the underbrush, keeping low, moving as silently as he could. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, any plan that would get him out of this alive. He couldn't fight them. He wasn't prepared for that kind of battle, not against being so strong, so relentless. But if he could find another place to hide, somewhere even more isolated, maybe he could buy himself enough time to think of something else. Harris's eyes scanned the trees ahead, looking for a gap in the thick forest, something he could use to his advantage. Then he saw it, a small clearing up ahead, barely visible through the foliage. It was risky, but it was the best chance he had. If he could make it to the clearing, he could circle around and double back, maybe even find a better hiding spot farther away. With determination, he moved toward the clearing, every step careful and deliberate. He wasn't sure if the alien women were still close, but he could feel the weight of their presence in the air, like a constant pressure, always hovering just beyond the edge of his awareness. He had to stay calm. If he panicked, if he rushed, they would hear him, sense his fear, and that would be the end. He was halfway to the clearing when a movement in the distance caught his eye. For a split second, he froze. One of the alien women had emerged from behind a cluster of trees, her sharp, glowing eyes scanning the area. She was too close, far too close. His breath hitched in his throat as she turned her head, her gaze sweeping across the area where he had been only moments before. It was as if she knew he was there, as if she could feel his presence in the very air around her. Harris's heart raced as he crouched lower, pressing himself into the ground, hoping she wouldn't spot him. She stopped. Her eyes narrowed, her sharp senses working overtime. Harris could see the way her nostrils flared, her head tilting slightly as if she were trying to pick up his scent. The forest was silent again, the air thick with tension. Harris's hands clenched into fists, every nerve in his body on edge, waiting for the inevitable discovery. He was too close. But then, just as quickly as it had happened, the moment passed. The woman turned away, her attention drifting toward the other aliens in the distance. She didn't notice him. Harris let out a quiet breath of relief, but he knew this was far from over. They were getting closer, and the longer he stayed in one place, the more likely it was that one of them would find him. As the alien woman moved off, he took the opportunity to slip into the clearing. It was small, just enough space to break through the dense undergrowth and keep moving without being seen. He pushed forward, his legs aching from the tension, his mind racing with the reality that he couldn't stay ahead forever. And then, just as he was about to pass through the clearing's edge, he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling behind him. Harris froze, his body tensed in an instant. He spun around just in time to see a figure emerging from the trees. The second alien woman, her eyes locked onto him immediately. There was no hesitation, no time to react. Her long, silver hair rippled like liquid, catching the fading light of the setting sun, and her posture was predatory, coiled, and ready to strike. Her gaze was cold, calculating, and she was moving toward him with a predator's grace. Harris's breath caught in his throat. He had been too slow, too careless. She had spotted him. There was no way to hide now. In a split second, he made a choice. He had no time to think, no time to prepare. Without a moment's hesitation, Harris turned and ran. The alien woman's laugh echoed in the clearing, a low, haunting sound that sent a chill down his spine. She wasn't chasing him out of desperation. She was chasing him for sport, to catch him when he thought he could escape. The hunt had just taken a deadly turn. Harris's legs burned as he sprinted through the forest, weaving between the trees. He could hear her behind him, closing the distance with terrifying speed. She was gaining on him, and he could feel the heat of her pursuit, like the press of a predator's breath on his neck. He didn't dare look back. He had to keep moving, keep running. But the forest was dense, and the path was narrow. Harris knew it would only be a matter of time before she caught up with him. His only hope now was to reach another hidden spot, somewhere the alien woman wouldn't expect. If he didn't, the game would be over. And that realization made the chase all the more thrilling. The distraction. Harris' lungs burned as he pushed himself through the dense underbrush, his legs screaming for rest with every desperate stride. The alien woman's pursuit was relentless. He could hear her footsteps behind him, swift and predatory, like a shadow stalking its prey. The crackling of branches under her feet was sharp, and her laughter, a low, chilling sound, seemed to echo through the forest, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. She was enjoying this, enjoying the chase. It was a game to her, one that she intended to win. His heart raced in his chest, but Harris couldn't afford to slow down. He needed to find a way to lose her, some kind of advantage, some distraction that could give him the upper hand. The path ahead was narrowing, and the trees grew thicker, their twisting roots forming a maze of obstacles that threatened to trip him. He barely avoided one, his foot catching on the uneven ground, but he kept running. There was no time to stop. And then, as if the forest itself had come alive in response to his desperate need, the air shifted. A strange, low rumble vibrated beneath his feet, almost like a distant thunderstorm gathering force. The ground trembled slightly beneath him, sending a shiver of unease through his body. He could feel it in the air. Something big, something powerful was moving through the forest. For a brief moment, Harris thought he had imagined it. But then the rumble grew louder, more distinct. The alien woman's pursuit faltered, her footsteps slowing for just a moment. Harris risked a quick glance over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of her before she could close the distance completely. Her eyes were fixed on him, but there was a flicker of confusion in her gaze. She paused, her head tilting slightly as if listening for something. Then the ground shook again. This time, the sound was unmistakable. Something large and heavy was moving through the forest. The alien woman stopped dead in her tracks, her head snapping to the side, her ears attuned to the new disturbance. Harris's pulse quickened. This was it, his chance. Without wasting a second, he veered sharply to the right, diving into a thicket of thick, purple vines and dense foliage. He crashed through the branches, his breath ragged as he stumbled forward, moving quickly but quietly. He could hear the alien woman's footsteps behind him again, but they were growing fainter. The distraction had worked. For a brief moment, Harris allowed himself to breathe. He moved farther into the dense underbrush, using the natural cover to hide. His heart was still hammering in his chest, but for the first time in what felt like hours, he wasn't being hunted. He didn't know what was causing the tremors in the ground, but he wasn't going to question it. He needed to stay hidden, stay alive, while he had the chance. But the rumble of movement was growing louder now. Whatever was making the noise wasn't far off, and Harris couldn't shake the feeling that it was something far worse than anything he had encountered so far. The air felt charged, and the strange energy in the forest intensified, swirling around him like a thick fog. He had to keep moving. The distraction had given him only a moment's respite, but he had no idea how long it would last. Harris continued to crawl through the underbrush, keeping as low to the ground as possible. He could still hear the alien woman searching, moving cautiously in the distance. Her pursuit had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. He was still very much in danger. The forest was vast, but it was also a trap, a maze that he had to navigate carefully if he hoped to survive. As he moved farther into the forest, the shaking of the ground became more pronounced. The rumbling was constant now, like the pulse of something huge and powerful approaching. Harris's eyes scanned the trees around him, looking for any sign of movement, any indication of what was causing the tremors. He felt a strange unease creeping up his spine. Whatever it wasn't just passing through the forest. It was moving with purpose. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the trees, followed by a deep guttural roar that seemed to shake the very air. Harris's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a tremor anymore. It was a full-scale disruption, a force of nature that was tearing through the forest with incredible speed. The alien woman's voice, once cold and confident, was now filled with surprise as she called out to the others, her tone filled with urgency. The hunt had stopped. The game was no longer about Harris. The sound of the creature's approach grew louder, and Harris dared not move from his position. He pressed himself further into the shadows, praying that whatever was causing the chaos would pass him by. The alien women were no longer interested in him. They had shifted their focus to the new threat, and that gave Harris the opening he needed. For a moment, everything went still. The rumbling stopped. The distant roar faded. The forest was eerily quiet once again. And then, in the distance, Harris saw it, a shape moving through the trees. It was massive, a hulking figure that seemed to defy all logic. The ground shook with each step it took. Its presence felt long before it was seen. It was unlike any creature Harris had ever imagined. Its form shifting and rippling like liquid, its massive limbs striking the earth with terrifying force. The air seemed to bend around it, vibrating with unnatural energy. Harris's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just an animal. It was something far more dangerous. The alien women were now on high alert, their movements frantic as they regrouped, searching for the source of the new threat. They were no longer thinking of Harris. He had become an afterthought in the face of whatever this new terror was. Harris's eyes widened in realization. The distraction wasn't just his chance to escape, it was his chance to survive. But the question remained, could he outrun this new nightmare? Could he stay ahead of it long enough to escape the forest, to make it out alive? The hunt had taken a terrifying new turn. The alien women close in. The forest had gone eerily quiet once again, but Harris could still feel the trembling of the earth beneath his feet, as though the very planet was alive and reacting to the chaos that had unfolded. The massive creature that had stirred the ground with its thunderous footsteps was still somewhere out there, but now Harris's immediate threat came from a far more familiar source. The alien women were closing in, their search for him reigniting with a ferocity that made his heart race. Harris crouched low, his breath shallow as he huddled in a dense thicket of purple vines and alien moss. He had been moving slowly, trying to stay as still as possible, but the alien women were relentless, and he could feel them drawing closer. Their presence seemed to loom in the very air around him. There was no way to outrun them now. They had zeroed in on his location, and it was only a matter of time before they found him. Harris's pulse quickened as he strained to listen, trying to pick up on any movement in the trees. The forest was vast, but they were moving in perfect harmony, covering every inch of ground with deadly precision. The first woman's footsteps were slow and deliberate, but Harris knew she was closing in. She was too close. He could hear the faint rustle of leaves as she moved, her sharp breathing almost synchronized with his own. She was scanning the area methodically, moving in a perfect arc, making sure she didn't miss a single clue that might lead her to him. Harris dared not breathe too loudly. Every second felt like an eternity as he waited for her to get too close for comfort. Then, as though guided by some unseen force, she stopped just a few feet from where Harris was hidden. He held his breath. The air felt heavy with tension. The only sound was the low hum of the forest, until a twig snapped underfoot, barely audible but enough to send a jolt of terror through his spine. Harris's eyes went wide, his body frozen in place as he gripped the hilt of his rifle. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought she had heard him. Her glowing eyes flickered in his direction, but instead of turning toward him, she raised her head slightly, sniffing the air. It wasn't him she had detected. It was something else, perhaps the lingering scent of the massive creature that had caused such a disturbance earlier. Whatever it was, the distraction had given Harris a tiny sliver of hope. The alien woman's gaze shifted, moving away from his hiding spot. Slowly, she turned, continuing her search, and for a fleeting moment, Harris allowed himself to exhale. But he knew better than to think she had given up. It wasn't over yet. She was simply recalculating, adjusting her strategy. These aliens were too smart to be thrown off track for long. With one last glance toward the edge of the thicket, Harris decided it was time to move again. He had to act fast. The woman had turned her attention elsewhere, but he couldn't afford to wait too long. He slid forward, crawling silently between the vines, hoping to gain some distance. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a shadow crossing the forest floor. He didn't get far. Just as he thought he was out of range, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, this time faster and more frantic. The second woman had spotted him. He had underestimated how quickly they could work together. The alien women weren't just searching individually. They were communicating, organizing their movements. Harris could hear their whispers in the wind now, faint but unmistakable. They were closing in from multiple directions. The second woman, taller than the first, moved with speed and grace, her eyes flashing with a sharp intensity. She was almost upon him, her long fingers brushing the dense foliage as she passed within arm's reach. Harris's heart seemed to stop as she paused for a fraction of a second, her head tilting, as if she could feel his presence just a heartbeat away. He could see the way her eyes scanned the area, calculating, precise. She was too close, and there was nowhere left to hide. He had to act. In that split second of panic, Harris made a decision. He had to take the chance. He wasn't sure how long the creature outside the forest would keep the aliens distracted, but he couldn't count on it forever. If he wanted to survive, he had to move. Now. Without thinking, Harris sprang from the ground, pushing his body through the underbrush in a burst of motion. His limbs ached with the sudden strain, but adrenaline fueled him as he broke through the cover of vines. The alien women were only a few yards away, but he had to push forward. The forest seemed to narrow around him, the once vast expanse now closing in as the alien women split up, herding him like prey into a trap. Harris's mind raced as he scanned the forest, looking for any opportunity, any chance to escape. He needed something, a diversion, a way to throw them off his trail, even if only for a moment. His eyes darted to the massive trees above him. If he could get to higher ground, maybe he could find a place to outweight them. But it wasn't a perfect plan. The aliens would think of that too. Just then, something shifted in the trees behind him. A sudden crack split the silence, and a shadow moved like lightning through the canopy. Harris's eyes widened as the massive creature, still making its way through the forest, appeared from the trees once more, its enormous form shifting like a mountain in motion. It was a terrifying sight, and for a brief moment, the alien women stopped, their gaze snapping to the new threat. They were momentarily distracted, their focus shifting from Harris to the danger that loomed just beyond. The ground shook once again, this time with the force of the creature's charge. Harris's breath caught in his throat as he watched the aliens hesitate, their eyes locked on the creature as it moved closer, a tidal force of nature making its presence known. The tension was palpable, the air charged with electricity, and Harris knew this was his one chance. For the briefest of moments, the alien women hesitated, looking to each other with uncertainty. This was his chance to move. The final stand. The ground beneath Harris's feet quivered with every footstep of the massive creature, its presence undeniable, a force of nature that rattled the very air around them. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down, as if the world had paused to take a breath. The alien women, once so confident in their hunt, now hesitated, their eyes locked on the approaching beast. Harris could see the tension in their movements, their posture shifting from predatory grace to a kind of cautious wariness. For the first time since this nightmarish pursuit began, they weren't the hunters, they were the hunted. It was his only chance. Harris's mind raced as he took in the scene. The alien women were distracted, but he couldn't afford to waste time. The creature moving through the forest was dangerous, but he didn't know if it would be enough to guarantee his safety. He couldn't count on its arrival for too long. The women were too resourceful, too smart. They would recover quickly. The clock was ticking, and Harris knew that the next few moments would decide his fate. His pulse thundered in his ears, each heartbeat a reminder that his time was running out. He glanced at the dense trees surrounding him, his escape route. There was only one problem. The alien women were too close. He could feel their eyes on him, sensing that he was about to make a move. They knew he wouldn't be content to simply sit and wait for them to find him. The tension between them was palpable. The creature's roar echoed through the trees again, this time louder, more primal, shaking the leaves from their branches. The alien women flinched, their bodies stiffening at the sound. Harris knew they were processing the new danger, trying to calculate their next move, but he couldn't afford to wait for them to finish their assessment. If he was going to survive, he needed to take action. Now, with a swift motion, he bolted toward the trees, pushing himself forward into a sprint. His legs burned as he dashed through the underbrush, the leaves and vines tangling at his feet. But he didn't dare slow down. Every second counted. The alien women were already regrouping, their eyes snapping back to him with newfound focus. Their hesitation had lasted only a moment, but it was all Harris needed. As he sprinted, his mind flashed to the training he had received back home. Tactics, survival techniques, how to think on your feet when the enemy had the upper hand. Now, it wasn't just about avoiding capture. It was about making a stand. He could hear the women's footsteps gaining on him, their speed matching his own, but they were not as fast as the massive creature behind them. The ground shook beneath him, and for the briefest of moments, the forest seemed to open up, as if the earth itself were pulling back to let him escape. But it wasn't enough. He needed more. Ahead, the forest split in two, the path narrowing into a small ravine that led to a rocky cliff. It was a dead end, but Harris had no choice. If he could reach it, he could turn and use the rocks as a shield. His rifle in his hands felt like a weight, a tool that would do nothing in a close encounter with these creatures. But maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to give him an edge if he had to fight. Harris made for the ravine, his legs pounding the ground beneath him. The gap between him and the alien women was closing fast, but they were still a few yards behind. He could hear their voices, a soft, eerie chant rising in the distance, a call to one another as they drew nearer. Harris's breath was ragged, his thoughts scattered. But one thing was clear. This was the moment where everything changed. As he reached the ravine, he skidded to a halt, his boots sliding against the loose stones, and turned to face the oncoming threat. The alien women were close now, too close. He could see their glowing eyes, their long limbs moving with an eerie fluidity. They weren't just walking anymore. They were moving with purpose, with the intent to capture. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Harris felt the weight of his situation. He was no longer just a soldier trying to survive. He was a man backed into a corner, surrounded by predators. The edge of the cliff loomed behind him, the jagged rocks below a reminder of the only other option he had left, a dangerous fall. The women circled him, their eyes glinting in the dim light, each of them inching closer, preparing for the final move. They were toying with him now, their slow, deliberate movements a cruel reminder of how powerless he was. The creature had provided a distraction, but it wouldn't save him. The women were too strong, too intelligent. And yet, despite the overwhelming fear that gripped him, Harris felt something else, something deeper. The same instinct that had kept him alive through countless battles, that had driven him to survive when the odds were impossible, kicked in. He was out of options, but he wasn't out of will. His fingers tightened around the rifle. He wasn't going to go down quietly. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. With a roar that echoed through the forest, Harris launched himself at the nearest woman, his body colliding with hers in a desperate attempt to throw her off balance. The impact startled her, sending her stumbling back into the trees. The others recoiled, momentarily caught off guard, and for just a split second, Harris had the opening he needed. But the fight was far from over. As the woman recovered and turned to face him, Harris realized something important. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting to show them that humans, no matter how small, how outnumbered, or how outmatched, would never be easy prey. The fight for survival had turned into a fight for pride, for humanity's right to stand against the odds. And for just a moment, that spark of defiance gave Harris the strength to keep going. Whatever came next, he was ready.